Leaving Cert Practical. Technology, 25%. As part of your Leaving Certificate Music Practical exam, you can assign 25% or 50% of your final assessment to music technology. This means you can do it in conjunction with another activity, for example, playing instrument, or as a standalone activity. Do note that you still have to perform as part of the technology exam, even if you are assigning 50% of your marks to music technology. This tutorial deals with the 25% option. This means you will also have to perform 4 pieces on an instrument and take an unprepared test such as sight reading, clapping back a rhythm, and so on. In the exam, you are expected to input via electronic instruments a musical score of at least 2 real parts. Save and retrieve and edit that score. For example, change the rhythms, the pitch, the dynamics, timbre, etc. And produce a taped and/or printed final version. This tutorial is a revision for my students only. There are many ways to approach the music technology exam, and this way is specific to my students. Other teachers may approach this exam differently. In this tutorial, we are going to go through the exam as it will happen, and we will be using the song "This Is What You Came For" by Rihanna and Calvin Harris as our exam piece. The software we are using is Finale Notepad. This is free software, and you should be practicing on this regularly. The first thing the examiner will ask you to do is to set up your score. On your desktop, double-click the Finale Notepad icon, and once the software opens, click File from the menu along the top. In the drop-down menu that follows, select New. You will then be presented with the Document Setup wizard, and you will be asked to enter the name of your piece and composer as follows. You will then be faced with the instrument selection box, which initially will look like this. At this point, you have to select the instruments or voices that you plan to use for your score. In this case, the guitar, which can be found in plucked strings, electric bass, also plucked strings, voice, and violin, which can be found in strings. Double-click on each instrument until all 4 instruments have been placed into the box furthest to the right, like this. Once you've done this, click Next. You will now see the Score Settings box. You don't have to change anything here, so just click Finish. You will now be presented with a blank score that looks like this. Above your score, you should see a selection of icons like this. You need to be careful here. These panels are movable, and somebody else using the same computer before you may have arranged them differently, but they should still be visible. It is unlikely, however, that they will be anywhere other than right above your score. Wait for the examiner to instruct you now. The examiner will now ask you to start inputting your music into the score. You should have your score with you for this, and the examiner will not have copies. Start your inputting at the start of the first instrument or voice. Do not leave a bar unfinished with the intention of coming back to it later. Also, keep inputting the same voice until the examiner tells you to move on. While it is very unlikely the examiner will ask you to input all the way to the end of your score, they just might. Now, input the guitar line like this. Keep inputting the guitar line until the examiner tells you to move on. In this tutorial, I am only going to do the first 4 bars of each instrument, but, and again, do not assume this is all you will be asked to do in the exam. Always keep inputting until the examiner tells you to stop and move on. Again, while it is unlikely you will be asked to input the entire score, you should assume that you will be asked to input the entire score. The examiner will then ask you to move on to your next instrument, which in this case is the electric bass. Here's how to do this. The rhythm is quite intricate in this line, so be careful when inputting. And again, keep inputting the bass line until the examiner asks you to move on. Take note as I approach this bar here, the last bar on the first line, the page may start reformatting, and you might find that a bar that was on the first line of your score is now on the second line of the score. Just watch out for that and keep an eye on the page as you're going along. You can see it has happened there. Bar 4 has moved on to line 2. When you are asked to move on to the next instrument, input the soprano line, like this. Again, remember that the position of the panels where you find your notes and rests along the top may differ from computer to computer, but they will be there, so don't panic and just calmly look for what you need. You will get time to practice before the exam on the computer that you will be doing the exam, but it is also essential that you are regularly practicing at home so you are comfortable with the software. Continue to input the soprano line until you are asked to move on by the examiner. And when asked to move on to the next instrument, which is the violin. Input your violin line like this. Once this is all completed, the examiner will probably ask you to play your work. You will now be asked to save and retrieve your work. Again, there are a few ways of doing this, but here is my preferred method. Do have a file name prepared for your file. Don't just use "this is what you came for," as there are probably other people using the same piece, or there may have been work saved using this name previously on the same computer. So for example, you could use your name and today's date. Keep in mind that you can't use slashes in a file name, so perhaps your name followed by the date without any slashes or dots in between the days and months. Here's how I would do this. Also, I would prefer it if you just closed and reopened your file as opposed to the entire software package, as constantly closing and opening the software can cause problems later on in the day. You are now expected to know how to do 3 edits. The edits we are doing are changing the tempo, changing the key signature, and changing an instrument or voice. When the examiner asks you to do your first edit, explain that you are going to change the tempo, and do so by highlighting the tempo setting, which will be set by default to 120. Change this to 160. If you change the tempo too drastically in either direction, it might be considered unmusical. You will be asked to play your file from the start after each edit. It is only when the examiner can hear the edit that it is deemed to have been a successful edit. Don't forget to go all the way back to the start after the song each time, as you could get easily flustered if your song starts later than you expect it to. You will then be asked to perform your second edit. Explain to the examiner that you are going to change the key signature. Again, we are not going to drastically change it. In this case, we are just going to move the piece up one tone to the key of D major, like this. Again, the examiner will ask you to play the file so that the edit can be heard. And do go back to the start of your file. This is a good habit to be in. You will then be asked to perform your third and final edit. Explain to the examiner that you are going to change an instrument, specifically the violin, to a different instrument, in this case the flute. This is slightly trickier than the first 2 edits. First, click on Window and then Score Manager. Scroll down to the instrument you want to change. You will see a large selection of instruments here. The flute is number 74 in this case, but this may not always be so. You should know where the flute is found in advance of your exam. Also note the score will still say violin, but the sound will have changed on playback. Finally, you are expected to produce a taped or printed version of your file. In our case, we are going to demonstrate that we can print our file. We don't actually have to print the file, just show that we know how to do this. To do this, either click on a picture of the printer or go to File followed by Print. Hit Cancel when the dialog box comes up, but make sure the examiner has seen first of all that you know how to print your work. And that's it, guys. Best of luck.